Hey everyone, welcome, 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 welcome. Welcome to the Impacted Family and Friends, part two of an eight-part webinar series on the complexity of murder-suicide. We know this is heavy lifting emotionally. And one of the things we're going to do tonight is try to give a little breakthrough on that because our conversation tonight is going to be on various shades of and threads around trauma. My name is Anne Marie Matulis. I am the co-founder and CEO of Impacted Family and Friends. We are an international movement for families and close friends impacted emotionally and traumatized by a loved one's suicidal experience. I also have the privilege of chairing the Impacted Family and Friends division with the American Association of Suicidology, and I'm very grateful to have work that I'm passionate about wrapped up into those two positions. Our guest this evening is going to be Dr. Kathleen Carter Martinez, and she is going to give you some, for me, I believe, incredibly helpful information. Her book is called Permission Granted. There's a much longer subtitle, but I can tell you, as someone who experienced childhood and adulthood trauma, that I thought I had this handled. And when I read that book, I realized, no, not quite. So I can tell you that it's a blessing. Now, I do want to make one acknowledgement. Today is the International Day of Families. I have to think of how to say that because I always want to say impacted family and friends. And this is with the United Nations. And it's 28 years old, heading to 30. And I am just so excited that what a perfect day for us to bring in this kind of informational presentation. It's really more of an informal conversation. Everybody stand up and chair. You're not going to see slides, no PowerPoint. I try to avoid that anyway, but I wanted to tell you what they were what the UN was focusing on in particular, and in particular for the things that we're dealing with right now. That the prolonged COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated the importance of digital technologies for work, education, and communication, and that the pandemic has accelerated technology changes that had already been underway both in society and at work, and that includes the use of digital platforms for everything. Well, Impacted Family and Friends went digital before the pandemic because we knew we needed to be able to reach more people, that not everybody would be able to just stroll into an in-person gathering. So we were just a step or two ahead of that curve. And I can tell you that it has been incredibly successful. We do workshops, wellness workshops for suicide attempt survivors, suicide loss survivors, and the family and close friends impacted by those losses and those attempts and other suicidal ideation. And it has, everybody said, oh, you can't do that. It's not going to work. Well, I have to tell you, yes, it does. And it works beautifully. So that's what I'm going to say about that. Shout out to the United Nations for developing an international day of families around the world. And we're grateful to be participating in that with this live stream. I am now going to put myself on mute. No cheering, please. I do have one thing to say about both Dr. Casey and myself. Allergies are really unpleasant. We are both suffering from it. She is sipping honey tea. You just saw her do it to try to avoid all the coughing and the sneezing. So we will try to remember to put ourselves suddenly on mute, and hope that we remember to do that. If not, just hold your ears a little bit if you're sensitive. But it's just a reality. For us, we're both in the Northeast. So allergies, everything's lime green. When with that said, Dr. Casey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne Marie. Can everyone hear me okay? Doing all right? One other thing that you need to be mindful of, and I apologize ahead of time, I have a habit of sitting on my feet. So you may see me getting up and down a couple times. I'll have to switch. I know I can't do it the entire time. So I'm very, very happy to be here. We have been waiting a long time to put this series together and to bring it out there. And for the United Nations to have a Family Day today is absolutely perfect, because if nothing else, we are about the family and we are about family members. So we're so happy, to add a shout out to all the wonderful work that they do too. So, a little bit about myself before we roll into some of the nuts and bolts of what we're going to talk about here. I'm a specialist in trauma and in the trauma of the crisis of suicide. And I should say right away that you may hear some phrases, you may hear me use some phrases that don't necessarily sound very familiar to you when talking about suicide, but they will resurface consistently in the conversations that we have here. I am a compassionate, mindful life recovery practitioner, and my work is to educate and help in the recovery from trauma. Interestingly enough, I'm what other people might define or describe as a multidisciplinary ball of wax, and I wear that banner proudly. I don't identify with one discipline my entire career. I have identified with more than one discipline because I have always seen the connections from one discipline to another. And having the ability to see that connection, interestingly enough, is what led me here, specifically to our work here today in this 8-part webinar series that we're doing on murder-suicide. It is a strange phrase to say how happy I am to be here. It's a dark topic, yes, but I am so happy that we are giving a voice to this dynamic and to this topic. And I'm very happy to be able to participate. And without a doubt, without question, I do believe it is my multidisciplinary background that enables me to do that today. And I'm really very happy to do that because I feel it's so important, the work that we're doing here. So why am I here? Why was I drawn to participate in this 8-part series? Today, I feel very blessed to say that I feel that I am the ambassador for impacted family and friends and a voice at the table. I feel in my work in trauma, we are really going to highlight how trauma affects and is connected to the life of impacted family members. So I'm very honored to be in that role today, to be able to share some of our insight with you and share some of our work with you and see how we are integrating a lot of different aspects that have not been connected before. I'm very honored to be chosen as a member of this team. Everyone, I do hope you will stay with us and you will join us for this 8-part series. I think I am accurate in saying there is not one part that is more important than the other. I think it is our integrated collaborative work that is what is going to be the benefit for people everywhere. So I hope that you choose to stay with us. I know that Anne-Marie will make sure that our dates are out there for everyone to see, and I'm going to invite you to please consider doing that. I'm very honored to connect all the work of our presenters. We have multiple presenters into the tapestry of trauma that is my passion. I have the opportunity to inform the understanding of IFF members. Who are they? What does IFF mean? And there's a very good possibility that many of you here today already know, already have a sense of what IFF means: impacted family members, and friends. Some of you, though, may not. And a lot of us at one point in our life did not know. And we're sort of like in a square space on suicide with a very limited understanding of what that really encompassed and what it really means. So let me stretch your definition a little bit right now so you can take this one with you when you leave. Another way to understand the impacted family member is this way: the first responder in residence. It is the family member in every household, in every family, who takes care of the issue at hand, of the crisis at hand. This makes them the first responder to the crisis that the family is going through. And for families who live in the chronic world of the crisis of suicide, this is a very serious matter. It's a very difficult dynamic in the family to deal with, and whether you choose it or not, whether you want it or not, whether you like it or not, somebody, and sometimes more than one person, who we understand as the impacted family member, does become the first responder in residence. So I'd like you to try to remember that phrase as it helps us to understand who exactly the IFF family member is and where and how are they involved. Where and how are they involved in the crisis of suicide? So I have a question for you to think about. Have you ever thought about the IFF impacted family member or friend who has lost one or more loved ones to suicide or a murder suicide? Just ask yourself, for the people that you're aware of, the families that you're aware of, how often do you think you have thought about them and the crisis that they have lived with? And I will add now, continue to live with. This is a very simple but very important question because it also is a signal as to our cultural limitations, as to how much we allow ourselves to really reflect on these struggles that other people may have in their families. On the other hand, there are many of us here who may also have these experiences within our own families. Now, another interesting point that I should share with you at this point, I don't want you to feel confused. If you do, it'll be temporary. In my work and in part of my work, I consistently speak in the collective voice of we. I always do that, and I do not change. So, depending on what we're talking about and the topic at hand, you may say, well, is she the presenter? Well, is she an IFF member? Well, has she made an attempt herself? Well, who or what is she? And then someone may say, well, maybe she's all of them. And isn't that the point? Isn't that the point? The collective voice of we allows us to all come together and all sit together and be supportive of one another in whatever way we are comfortable. The collective voice of we allows us to listen and to attend to others in a way that we are comfortable with. And that can change. So don't get confused. It might feel confusing at first, but I think after a little while, you may follow the flow of how I tend to consistently speak in the collective voice of we. You'll probably hear me say we a lot. Whoop, gotta move the foot. Okay. You probably hear me say we a lot, and that's okay. It's anybody and everybody. So to get started, really, to get to the topic of trauma, we need to reframe where we started. In our series, our 8-part webinar series started with Dr. Thomas Joyner, Murder Suicide webinar, which was amazing. Now, I don't know how many of you were able to attend, but if you weren't, no worries, don't panic. It will be available in the near future for you to go back and visit and sit through his webinar. When I tell you, it was most excellent. It was most excellent and also inspiring. And keep in mind, this is a very difficult topic to talk about. And even the choice to be here to attend this webinar series, not necessarily. I mean, if someone says to you, what are you doing Saturday night? Well, I'm going to go sit in on a murder suicide webinar. That's interesting. Of course, the questions are always there. Why? Why would you even want to? So I want to really emphasize with respect to Dr. Joyner's work. His webinar is amazing. I encourage everyone, if you would like to be invested in the whole 8-part series, please go back to the beginning. He was the first part. I'm the second part. I encourage you to go back and watch his webinar and listen very carefully to what he has to share with us. Now, his webinar is very much a reflection of his work in his book that has come out, The Perversion of Virtue. And I have to tell you, when I first heard that title, I stepped back. I step back and I'm like, what? Because I'm like, what does this mean? What is he trying to tell us? So, of course, I read his book. I have to. I was extremely inspired by his book. It was comprehensive in a way that many people would understand to be very difficult. It would be very difficult, but he has done that. And here's what we need to understand about Dr. Joyner's work and our work here. He is speaking about the unspeakable. Now step back and just say to yourself the word suicide. Generally speaking, most people have a knee-jerk reaction to pull back. People want to pull back, especially if it has never touched them or their life. Not only do they want to pull back, but they want to keep it away. So it's not an easy topic to talk about. There is the possibility that most conversations that do occur around the topic of suicide do occur from people who are either working in the field or people who have been affected in one way or another. So now add the concept of murder suicide. Now, very many people would be very uncomfortable not wanting to talk about that. And that is understandable. However, you don't even have to go beyond the last 6 months. I'm sure if you clear your mind and think about the last 6 months and some of the things we have heard in the news, it seems as if we've had one incident after another of a murder suicide. And what is the one thing that, first of all, when we hear about a murder suicide, generally speaking, our knee-jerk reaction is, oh my God, what happened? I don't understand. There isn't any explanation when you hear the story, and that's what people want to hear. They want to hear the story about what happened this time to try to understand what happened. Most of the time, the story does not help us understand. It's just describing the incident, who was involved, and what happened. So I want to really give a lot of credit to Dr. Joyner for speaking about the unspeakable. And it's critically important because we are expanding the conversation on suicide. We are expanding the boundaries of suicide. We are bringing in many aspects of the crisis of suicide that have just never been given enough attention. We have not focused on it enough. There isn't any way we can do that and ignore the element of murder-suicide, which is significantly on the rise at this point in time. There is some speculation, and I believe Dr. Joyner did mention this in his webinar about the connection between the COVID pandemic and an increase in suicide number one, and then murder-suicide. And I'm sure we can all understand that living through such extreme circumstances has put people and pushed them to limits that they probably never thought they would ever have to try to function under. So there is reason to understand that these dynamics have increased during that time. There are social constructs that are sort of illusions. We have, as a society, as a culture, we have an inability to simply be with or stay with someone or a family where suicide has come home. Culturally, we just don't want to do it. And the way our mind works is the faster we can get into help and the faster we can leave, the better off we are. Doesn't necessarily mean the better off the impacted family member is, or the better off a person who has made an attempt and has survived it. But it's how we are wired. Culturally, our social constructs have wired us this way. And it flies in the face of the type of intervention, support, and care that is needed for the crisis of suicide. So why is the IFF family member, remember now we're going to recognize them as the first responder in residence, relevant to this conversation about murder and suicide? Because every suicide is someone, somewhere in the family who is in the role of the first responder. Now, if it is just a suicide, they are in the role of the first responder of managing the care, the intervention, the plan. What do we do now? Where do we go? How do we do it? But even in situations where the final act, behavioral act, has resulted in the loss of life by suicide, the impacted family member, the first responder in residence, is critically important. In most instances, anything and everything that needs to be done would not happen if it were not for the first responder in residence. So, in the case of a murder suicide, when in many instances more than one person has lost their life, one or both of these people, and in some instances, as Dr. Joyner did go over with us in his webinar, the instances where parents take the lives of their own children, we're talking about more than one or two people. You don't know. It depends on the family. Somebody somewhere has to be that family member who is going to respond to the surviving family members. That is not an easy person to be, and it's not an easy role to be in. So the impacted family member, with respect to the crisis of suicide, with respect to suicide, with respect to murder and suicide, is always, always an essentially important figure in all of these dynamics. So ask yourself the question, have you ever thought about the role of the family members who live with the crisis of suicide? Have you ever thought, I am one of those people? Or have you ever asked yourself, am I one of those people? We don't always think this way. Even in instances where a family struggles with the crisis of suicide, and it's sort of like everyone knows it's always going on there and it's happening again, we tend to set ourselves apart and feel that we are not like them, that they are different, that there's something going on in that family that would never go on in our own family. But even in instances where we are aware that if it's our family who is having the trauma of crisis of suicide, and we know of another family, we don't always necessarily connect where perhaps we should. Perhaps some of the benefit of connecting with other people who are in fact living the same struggles that we are living would help, as opposed to feeling isolated and not connecting with anybody, which is typically what happens most of the time, unless you happen to know some people, like other impacted family members or other people who work in the field who are available to help you. Too often, families and impacted family members and the first responder in residence is on their own. And that is a very, very frightening place to be. So we're going to shift now. I want to shift. I wanted to build the foundation from where we started with the 8-part webinar series with Dr. Joyner's work, Murder Suicide. And we're trying to get to trauma, which is already here. It's already in the middle of the story. But we need to build the foundation, the pathway, if you will, for how are we going to get there. So let's try to start connecting to trauma. But the first thing I want to talk about is worldview. Now, that may not be a phrase a lot of people are familiar with, nor the phrase Weltanschauung, which I absolutely love. I love the phrase Weltanschauung, and anytime I get to say it, I'm very happy. Worldview is Weltanschauung. It is our view. It is how we see our world. It's our own space. We feel safe there. We have a sense of well-being. But we have a sense of how our world is and how our world should be. And I cannot emphasize this enough. We all have a sense of how we think our world should be. And for just a minute now, I just want you to step back If any of you live with the crisis of suicide in any way within your lives or your families, can you think back to when it wasn't there? Can you think back to when it wasn't there? Are you able to see a difference between what you might describe as your worldview before the crisis of suicide came into your family or your family members, and see the contrast between that view and your worldview now? So, well-intention and worldview is very important, and it's essential to who we are and to how we function. We don't always think about it. And one of the reasons we don't always think about it is we're not always aware of it, but it is there. So here's the question. Can you think of a time when you felt that your worldview, your own worldview, was out of balance? Was out of balance. What happens when our worldview is out of balance? Nothing feels okay. It's like a wonky feeling. You know what I mean? Sometimes you can't put your finger on it. You know something is off, something's not okay. Let's bring this home. Let's bring this specific to the crisis of suicide. If you live with the crisis of suicide, many people can understand this. You can go through a phase where in your thinking, you're like, wow, is it over? Are we done? Is nothing going to happen again? Are we in a better place? And you sort of get like a very guarded sense of things are better. Things are better and we're doing better. But then there's some hinky wonky feeling that sneaks in. Most people can describe it. It comes sneaks up on the back of your neck there and the hair on your arms. You can't put a finger on it. It has nothing to do with anything that is happening right now. Has everything to do with how you are wired to remember where you have been. You have an internal radar system that basically starts going off, like something's going on, something's not okay. So can you think of a time when you felt that your worldview was out of balance? And this is true now. Anyone here who has no relationship at all with the crisis of suicide is more than welcome to be here. But the question pertains to you too. Can you think of a time when you felt that your worldview was out of balance? How do you feel when your worldview is out of balance? If we hang around and talk about worldview long enough, we would start talking about, well, what can we do to make it better? How can we change that? But quite often when it comes to the crisis of suicide, and to be clear, with our loved ones and with ourselves, there's great difficulty in trying to stabilize that sense of being out of balance. It really requires taking a look at where we are, what's going on, what's not going on. And it's really disturbing feeling to be reacting and responding to something that hasn't happened yet, except you've seen it happen before, and you feel like maybe it's happening again. So this really disturbs worldview. It creates all these hinky feelings. And it's not bad in this respect because very often having that ability and having that radar helps us pay attention and helps us say, you know what, we really need to double down here. We need to check in. We need to see what's going on. So some more social constructs and cultural illusions. This is one of my favorite illusions. And when you're teaching this on a college campus, it's so interesting to watch the faces of the students that you're working with. You're talking about life because they're there to start off. They're there to start to figure it out, where are we going to go? And here's what generally we think. Our social constructs are built on a picket fence, basically a linear line on a picket fence. The illusion and the social constructs that we carry around with us is that somehow we're in control of everything in life that happens on this picket fence. We can start from the time we're born. We can start at a very young age, preschool, kindergarten, school, all the way up to graduating from college, and the old concept of getting engaged, getting the house with the white picket fence, and getting married. In that line, death is also there because, in a strange way, we're sort of conditioned that we know we're going to lose people that we love in our life. But it's a very different construct because it's one of acceptance. We have the ability to accept that we lose certain people in our lives, but only at certain times. Has a lot to do with age and has a lot to do with the way our culture views age. So in these social constructs, when we create the timeline, the loss of people that we love is much further down the line, because in our thinking, we're like, well, that makes sense. Like, we can kind of accept that because that person is so old or that person is getting older. What do we find out? And this is so interesting when you're working with college students. Life is not a picket fence, not at all. In fact, life is really a linear circle. You take that same picket fence, you bring it around, and you make a circle. What does that provide for us? It provides a view that anything in life can happen to any of us at any time, at any given time, and in no given order. Now, that's a real curveball. That's a real curveball. If you take that linear circle and you put the crisis of suicide in the middle of it, the crisis of suicide makes a lot more sense. It makes a lot more sense because in most of our thinking and in our hearts, we believe that the crisis of suicide should never be there. Shouldn't be there for anybody. Shouldn't be there for me, for you, for anybody else. But the reality is that it is there. If we try to put that on a picket fence, there is no place to go. No place to go. So we have to conceptualize it in a way that we can understand where and how it may manifest in our lives, in our experiences with our families. And anyone who has any relationship with the crisis of suicide understands it comes back numerous times, and it comes back anytime it wants to. And we have very little control over it. The best we can do is to try to be prepared to deal with it when it comes again. Within this framework of the picket fence, we believe that we're in control of all things in our life. From this viewpoint, though, we separate ourselves from all things bad. Tragedy, accident, suicide, and death. These are bad things. These are bad things. But bad things happen to other people. They don't happen to us. That's the beauty of the picket fence. It really is. It's kind of like the grass underneath the fence. Kind of says, not going to happen to me. I'm sorry bad things are happening someplace else, but not on my timeline and not in my picket fence. We tend to believe that if we do not acknowledge these bad things that are happening, if we stay away, remember I said before, people back up, they want to stay away. The illusions and the social constructs that we hide behind tell us we are safe, that we are immune, from these bad things that do happen to other people. And you have to think about how powerful that is. And to a large extent, we live that way for a long time until something pops up in our linear circle that comes sooner than later. And that forces us to take a look at our perceptions and how we understand when and how the events of life can happen. Our culture is what is described as a Fixit culture, and it doesn't work. We have very little ability to be able to be present within a crisis, to be present within a tragedy. Everything in us is wired to want to fix it. Now, for anyone who has lost a family member, to the crisis of suicide, we understand there is no fix-it. For anyone who is fearful, is this the next time? Is the next time going to be it? Is something going to happen this time that we cannot fix? These are fears that we live with, but we can't fix it. Our culture, though, is very much wired that way. One of the people I follow very closely in my work, very much mirrors his, is Dr. Gabor Mate, who's Canadian. And he says, when he speaks, of course, you envision that he is speaking up here in Canada and we're down here. And he says, south of the border, we are unable to deal with tragedy and crisis. We are simply unable. And I would extend that even further to say, in many ways, we are unwilling. We are unwilling to do the work, to be present, have to stay within the moment of a tragedy and a crisis. And what it takes to stay within the crisis of suicide is an incredible amount of courage and tenacity, which you need in the face of great fear. So I think he has a very good point. South of the border, I think we can do a lot better. I'm hoping that our work here together and everything that we're doing is going to help people understand that we need to do better. We need to change our perspective on the crisis of suicide. So a couple things before we get too close to trauma, things I want you to know. In my work, wherever I am, whatever I'm doing, I hold space for the voice of silence, for the voice of silence. This is where anyone can be who chooses to be silent, who is uncomfortable talking about their own experience, who is uncomfortable sharing their own experience, who is living with so much pain that talking about their pain or their fear is beyond them, and they find solitude and comfort in silence. I hold space for the voice of silence. I also say that this is the space for people who may decide that for the rest of their life, this is where they're going to stay. This is where they are comfortable. They are very comfortable being in the community of other people who have had a shared experience. They can identify, but their comfort is in being in the group where people have shared experience and they can hear about the experience reviews of others. The other comfort is simply being part of a community where you feel accepted. And with IFF and a voice at the table, we do not ask anyone to qualify to be there. If you want to be with us and to sit with us, the door is open. You are welcome. You come sit in our circle, and there, once you come, there is forever a place for you. And if your place is the voice of silence, we're fine with that. We're good with that. I already said I consistently speak in the collective voice of we. You might have picked up on that by now. I do. And I do it intentionally because within our organizations, we don't ask people to identify. You don't have to qualify. There's no criteria to qualify to be here. If you believe that you are comfortable in the IFF community or a voice at the table community, then that's where you belong. We're not going to ask you to qualify to be there. The collective voice of we speaks for everybody. It speaks for everybody. It allows you to be part of us. It allows you to listen, and allows everybody and anybody, if and when you are ready to speak or share wherever you've been and whatever your pain is. So the collective voice of we is kind of intended to confuse you, but it's confusion in a good way. You may not be sure who I am. You may not be sure what role I have. You may not know. Is she the presenter? Is she an impacted family member? Is she an attempt survivor? Who is she? And it's okay with me if you end up with maybe she's everybody, because that is who a lot of people are. So the collective voice of we, to me, is home for everyone. And we never ask this question. You will never hear me ask this question in any of the trauma work that I do. Did this happen to you? We do not need to ask that question. If you're here, that's enough. That's all we need. And if it's talking one-on-one with someone or in a small group, it's enough. We don't need to say, did this happen to you? In working with trauma, one of the first ways you can shut somebody down who may in fact be taking first steps to wanting to try to do some kind of work with the trauma that they have experienced and are living with is to say, did this happen to you? A very wise investigator, police investigator, told me years ago. And he investigated crimes against women for a very long time. And he never asked that question. He learned very quickly, if he did say, did this happen to you? The door shut. There was no more conversation. No more conversation. But if he used the phrase, and I have used this phrase in my work for years, what would you like me to know? What would you like to tell me? What would you like to share with me? I can tell you as a trauma specialist, just watch somebody's physical presence and their body language. You just see the tension ease. I'm not going to tell you it goes away because it doesn't, but I'm going to tell you it creates a sense of safety where the first feeling a person then has is, I have a choice here. I have an option here. And generally speaking, when trauma happens, people lose their choices and their options. So one of the things we want to get back to as quickly as we can is recreating the sense that I do have choices. I do have options. And I can't emphasize that enough. And this extends beyond working in the crisis of suicide. It is in everything that I do in my work of trauma, wherever that trauma lands, wherever I go, where that trauma is. These are my mantras. And it's very simple. I'm very simple in the way that I interact and talk with people. I also understand that there are times when people are unable to say anything, unable to say anything. And that's okay too. That is okay too. I'm going to tell you a really quick story. I think I have a few minutes to throw it in here. Years ago, someone asked me this recently. This is why I'm thinking about it. They said, how did you get into like this line of work? It's very hard to define my line of work, but it's there. And I thought back to when I was very young, and my career started out in the healthcare field, but I had a passion. I had a passion for what we now would describe as crimes of violence against women. Does anyone remember, and I cannot be the only one in the room who remembers the book, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape? Susan Brownmiller, I think. I read the whole book. I was determined to somehow change my life, take the course I was going in, to be going down that path. Now, back then, we weren't talking about trauma. We were not talking about trauma at all. We might have been talking about bad things that happen to women, but we were not talking about trauma. There was a job available that came available in the Morris County Community Prosecutor's Office for an advocate for the Rape Crisis Division. I applied for it. Just imagine this. I applied for it. They called me. I went for the interview. I have to tell you, I looked very professional. I looked okay. Guess who interviewed me? A team of prosecutors and investigators. There were 6 men in that room. That was who interviewed me for the position of advocate for the trauma of rape against women. The interview went very well. I got a nice letter and I got a phone call saying, it was a great interview, but you're too young. You don't understand what happens to women. Go back and get some more education. So I got a degree in forensic psychology from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. The job came open again. I applied again. I went for the interview. Again, all men. For the position of someone to deal with trauma for women. I got another nice letter and another recommendation that said the things that happen to women are too difficult for you to deal with. Go get more experience and go be older. So, you know what my message is to them now? Here I am. That's my message now. But the whole concept of trauma was so misunderstood back then. And the view was that men were the only ones that understood what was happening. So trauma has come a long way. It has been with me for a long time, and it always will be until I'm done doing whatever it is I'm going to do. So let's go back for a minute. I did have another question. I don't think I put it out there. Have you given much thought to family members beyond, I don't know how they live with this, to family members that lose someone to the crisis of suicide, to family members that lose someone to the crisis of murder-suicide? How much thought do we really give to this type of trauma, or the social constructs that we are currently living in? Are we limited? Do we have the horrific reaction, the horrific response? Do we have the knee-jerk reaction to do something immediately to help? And then once the funeral is over, we just don't seem to know what else we can say or what else we can do. And we're talking about lifelong trauma in both instances. When there has been loss of life due to the crisis of suicide, when there has been loss of life due to the crisis of murder-suicide. And make no mistake about it, murder-suicide is a crisis in our culture right now.
Casey,
yeah.
can I just ask for a quick pause here? Can you see Cheryl's comment?
Give
Can
me
you
a
put
second.
that on your screen? I'll read it to you.
Okay.
All right. It's been a challenge losing family members to murder as well as suicide and being an attempt survivor. I can't imagine how isolated, impacted families must feel to a murder-suicide.
I think that is such a powerful statement. That is such a powerful statement.
And I also wanted to share with you a couple of comments that came up. Joseph's with us tonight.
Hi, Joseph.
The collective voice of we is such an amazing way to present, as it allows everyone to have a seat
That's
at
right.
the table.
You're right, Joseph. You're so right.
And then Marjorie noted, there is a comfort in we, and I so identify with that. And we had a couple. Jackie's. I think Jackie's is really important because we're talking about suicide in a different tone. That grief and trauma, it's not a competition.
No, it isn't.
You know, and you and I, Dr. Casey, have talked about that. One is not. It's like the 8 parts of this series. One is no more important than the other. Together, they have an incredible power. We go up, and I just want to check. There was Cheryl. Oh, yeah, Cheryl had another comment earlier. Once you've experienced the quote darkness on a deep level, quote, many just continue to see the darkness in the world.
That's true.
And then, go ahead.
Especially when people are left alone. When people are left alone, there isn't any place else to go. It requires a connection to, and I don't want to put it requires a connection to another person, but I don't want to put that on the person who was wounded. What it requires is someone from the outside reaching in. That otherwise, as Cheryl said, staying in the dark side is so easy, such an easy place to be. But we should not put that burden on the wounded person, the person who was wounded. We should put that on us to be aware that we have a role here, that we have something that we can do to be of service and to help others at a time when, in a large percentage of times, it is almost impossible for someone to reach out. And I can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah. And I find it fascinating that you use the term wounded, since Cheryl's passion is the wounded healers.
I know. Well, I mean, it is the perfect
Yeah.
phrase. It is
Yeah.
perfect. And, that is how one of the ways that we can help others and ourselves understand how we view people who have had these experiences in their life. To think that someone is not wounded is really beyond comprehension. We should expect that these type of experiences and losses, because we do have losses, wound people, fracture people.
Yeah.
And healing, which we will get into probably in the third trauma series, is not something that happens by oneself. It involves other people.
And I did have one more, and I hope I have not distracted you from.
Not at all.
Tracy Oser, who is our IFF coordinator up in Washington State, noted that confusion in my worldview makes me feel out of control with my surroundings. That was earlier in and I tell you, I've been giving some thought to that one. I'm going to have to do some journaling tonight. So I'm going to hide all of the comments and turn it back to you. Thank you.
But let me just go to Tracy's thought there. That is a classic example of what a shattered worldview feels like. This is what happens when our worldview is not what it used to be. Keep in mind that with the crisis of suicide, and our worldview becomes shattered, and however that resolves, and we know we have sad endings, and then we have chronic cycles where we have people going through one episode after another. The worldview of other people around you doesn't change. It's our worldview that changes. And that's that feeling that Tracy's talking about. It's very surreal. It's very surreal. Like, how do you fit in? How do you fit into the world around you that pretty much has what we might define as a normal worldview, when in fact, our worldview is shattered and we are free falling. And free falling is a very surreal feeling. It happens when our worldview is shattered and when we cannot get our bearings, we've lost our balance, and we can't get a grip on things. So I'm glad Tracy brought that up and you introduced that here, because when we start to talk about trauma, a fractured or broken worldview is how trauma finds us. That's how trauma finds us. Something happens, something changes. So what's happened? How do we know when something has happened? Yet we do know, we feel that our worldview is challenged and shattered. Now, it's important to note here with respect to the crisis of suicide, again, in the social constructs that we happen to be living under, generally, if you tell someone that you lost a loved one to the crisis of suicide, there's a really heartfelt reaction. I'm so sorry this happened. I'm so sorry for your loss. You don't necessarily get the same reaction if you say, well, I was in the ER with my loved one, they made a suicide attempt. Oh, well, where are they now? Well, now we're back home. Oh, okay. You don't get that same compassionate response. And it's sad to say, because the worst has not happened. But anyone who has a loved one who lives in the crisis of suicide and goes through one cycle after another, one phase after another, knows how that feels. People who are not familiar with that experience have more of a black and white. And again, this is our culture. If we lose someone, if someone dies, we understand that. We're compassionate, we're sad. We offer a shoulder to cry on. If we say, no, luckily we did not lose this person, we're still holding on to them. How many people here know, Anne-Marie, I'm sneaking this question in. How many people here know what it means to hold on to someone who is having trouble holding on? How many people know what that feels like? It's exhausting. So when someone else says, well, I'm so glad nothing happened, but I'm going to go on my way now, they don't understand that this is an ongoing cycle. There is in the linear circle with chronic crisis of suicide, any place, anytime, this can pop up, and it can pop up repeatedly. How many people do we know go through cycles of one attempt after another and then things quiet down? This is not something that people who are not familiar with the crisis of suicide understand. This contributes to a shattered worldview. This contributes to a feeling of instability and insecurity. Where is your sense of, is it over? Is it over? Is it finally over? Or when is it going to happen again? How many people here have said, you know what, tonight I'm just going to cross my fingers and hope that everything's okay? Not because we don't care, but because we're tired. So if you're not familiar with the crisis of suicide, having a shattered worldview as in respect to the crisis of suicide is very difficult for people to understand. Now, one thing did happen. One thing has happened that has familiarized almost all of us with the presence of and meaning of worldview, and that is the COVID pandemic. The COVID pandemic put us all on the same level. On the same level. Our worldviews, whether you're aware of it or not, whether we even had a sense of it before, maybe we're not shattered for everybody, but for many of us, we're certainly challenged, certainly out of balance. We were out of whack. We were wonky. And why shouldn't we be? Because what was okay? Very little for a very long time was okay. But that's the best example I have of how, as a culture, we became aware of the importance of worldview. Now, if we just go on a little bit and just talk about trauma as it relates to murder-suicide, we have a very simple analogy here. And in a way, it's easy to understand it by saying murder-suicide is like a hand in a glove. You have to talk about these two things together when these dynamics occur together. And I want to just go back for a minute to Dr. Joyner's work. He identifies 4 virtues that are the foundation from which we can understand how people make the decision to commit a murder-suicide. 4 different virtues. And when you first hear them, you're like, this is crazy. But when you look at them and you listen to some of the cases that are examples of the different type of virtues, they make perfect sense. Another thing he differentiates in his work, and I think it's worth looking at, he had to make a decision between calling this murder-suicide or homicide-suicide. And he chose murder-suicide, and he had very specific reasons for doing that, and I think that's worth a listen. If you would like to have some insight as to why this is going on, why it continues to go on, go back and take a listen and pay attention to some of the points that he really highlights. Today, we can ask ourselves, can we have murder without trauma? What do you think? I mean, is it possible for murder to occur without trauma being involved? Ask yourself this question. Can we have suicide without trauma? It's a hand in a glove. You cannot separate one from the others. But tonight I'm going to give you the answer. No, we cannot have suicide without trauma. If we have suicide, we have trauma. If we have any aspect of the crisis of suicide, we have trauma. If you are a family member or a parent who is trying to hold on to a child who is struggling to do better and to get out of the cycle of the crisis of suicide, you're experiencing trauma. It is traumatic to be fearful that you may lose a child. It is traumatic to be fearful that you may lose a husband or a wife. It is traumatic to be fearful that you may lose any child. So, suicide and trauma are hand in a glove. They go together. And here's my question: where is the corresponding alarm? Where is the corresponding response? In our culture, we remove ourselves from traumatic events, but why don't we have that intrinsic, compassionate empathy response to the crisis of suicide? Why can't we identify that this is trauma? Why can't we understand that the impact on an individual, a family, is significant? And why don't we have the compassion to understand that we are talking about lifelong trauma? We need to think about these things. Trauma is the great equalizer. Another social construct and illusion. Trauma happens to someone else. How many people, just ask yourself, no hands, you don't have to answer. How many people ever found themselves in the middle of a crisis for someone else and thought, this happens to someone else? Doesn't happen to me. And here's the best one of all. It's not going to happen in my family. This doesn't happen in my family. This is one of the most deeply entrenched social constructs that we have. It's dangerous because it doesn't allow us to be aware and to prepare for possibilities in our own lives, nor does it allow us to be present and compassionate to the needs of others. Trauma brings us all to our knees, every single one of us. And I'm talking about all forms of trauma, not just the crisis of suicide. Trauma brings us down. The COVID pandemic trauma brought us down. All of us across race. Trauma does not care what your race is, what your ethnic background is, how much money you have, do you have a bank account, what community you live in, what kind of a job you have. Trauma is the great equalizer. It does not care. And when trauma comes, it comes to stay. And it takes up residence in our hearts, our minds, our spirits, and our thoughts. It leaves an imprint on us, in us holistically, in every aspect of our experience that will stay with us. When trauma comes, for many, tomorrow never seems to come. And for many, it seems like it's always yesterday. This is especially true in the crisis of suicide. At the same time, it's especially true in all forms of sexual assault or rape. It's especially true in all forms of domestic violence. So it seems that trauma has a common footprint. When it comes to stay, and it affects every aspect of our experience. This is how trauma gets here. When our worldview has been shattered, when we are out of balance, when we're out of sync, trauma comes in and it stays. So here's one more question, I think. Two more questions for you. Did you ever imagine that trauma would find you? Just just think about it, answer the question yourself. And is this the first time that you realize that maybe what has been part of your life has been trauma? Is this the first time that you've realized that your sense of worldview is not what it used to be? When our worldview is fractured, we are vulnerable. We are no longer safe. And what makes us safe is our connections to other people. And if our connections are shattered, they're out of balance. If you have a strong connection with a member of your family in healthy times, and now they are struggling within the crisis of suicide, that connection is challenged. And that feels like a loss. That is a very powerful loss and struggle to live with. Now, just a little bit of a heads up going forward, okay? The next trauma live stream, number 2, we're going to walk around some of these areas and connect them to what we've already started with building here. What happens when trauma comes? How does it change us? What do we do when we have been affected by trauma? And I'm just going to add a little question here right now and saying, is anyone wondering if they have been affected by trauma now? Has that crossed anyone's mind? What does trauma look like on a person who has lost a loved one to the crisis of suicide? What does it look like? I can suggest that it never looks the same. I can suggest that. Trauma leaves you feeling, who am I? And then the questions, can I decide who I want to be if trauma is in my life? Am I different? Am I affected? How can I decide who I want to be? Can I decide how I want to be? And who defines who I am after the crisis of suicide has come to my life? We're going to go down these pathways. We're going to go down them. We're going to show the connections, and we're going to show the connections as it integrates into the crisis of suicide. My last question for you tonight is, did you ever imagine that trauma would find you? If it has, a few closing thoughts. I just want you to stay with me right now. Everyone, just stay with me. I have a lot of information here. What I want you to know is, if you didn't know it before, that the crisis of suicide is directly related, a close relationship relative to trauma. If trauma has come into your life, well, let's turn that around. If the crisis of suicide has come into your life, so has trauma. If the crisis of suicide has come into your life and your family members are still here and still holding on, trauma is still here. And if the crisis of suicide has taken someone from you that you love, trauma is absolutely here. I would just like you, as we leave, to please think about some of the thoughts that we have talked about tonight, specific to your own experience and your own concerns that you've had, and see if you see any connections for yourself. If you see connections for yourself, then I'm hopeful when we go into trauma number 2, we're going to also start showing some hope in how we move towards the journey to healing. And the last thing I want to say to you tonight, and you can trust me on this, there is a journey to healing. And that is so for everyone. Thank you, Anne Marie, for having me.
I was ready for you to go on for another hour at least. No,
Well,
I want to thank you. I really want to thank you. You and I have talked about this for a long time. It's been awesome that we brought this together. So really quickly, anybody will give about 5 minutes if you have a takeaway, just something more that you wanted to offer. Cheryl said, absolutely. I think that's to the thank you and everything. What did Jackie just say? Is she swearing at us? No. Oh my God, so good.
oh, Jackie, thank you. That means so much coming from you. Thank you.
Yep, and I did put in there that Trauma 2 is on June 10th at 7 p.m. Same location, the same 2 faces you'll see. But in between, I did post it, is to just again remind you that next Friday on the 21st at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time, it will not be a live stream like this. It will be a webinar with Stephanie Willard.
I
And
missed that.
Stephanie is a survivor of murder-suicide, one of the few in the country who has stepped up to become an activist and advocate, because there are no resources for people with that specific
Oh, see.
horrific experience. And then after Stephanie on the 27th, you really don't want to miss this one either. We're putting together two, talk about an odd couple, but two very vocal advocates and activists for the truth. And Eric Hewson, who is with, if you look up hashtag same here, has done incredible work, just released new partnerships with the NFL Players Association and several major league professional sports teams. His heart is so embedded in helping people come out of that darkness that you mentioned, Cheryl. He and Dr. Bart Andrews are going to take on the media and how they create a problem of truth and healing with their coverage. And then Dr. Mike Anestis will talk to us on June 4th about firearm safety. And again, if you know Mike's work at all, you know that he's not coming in to take everything out of your hands, just teaching people to be more safe at home if they do have a firearm in the building. And then Kevin Hines will step up on June 7th at 4:30 Eastern Time, and Dr. Casey and Dr. Thomas Joyner and Dr. Mike Anestis and Eric Hewson and Dr. Bart Andrews and Stephanie are all going to gather around the table, and we're going to talk about this 8-part series. And equally important is, what are our next steps? Where are the gaps that we need to continue to shed light on? And that will be a series that will begin when we determine all of those factors. That will be a series that will begin in the late fall, as this is a 3-year project. I probably should have mentioned that to all the people involved. And in between, we'll also be talking about a number of other subjects. So I wanted to thank you. I see that some others are stepping in. Mostly it's thank yous. What does Joseph say again? Thank you so much. All amazing and very accurate points. Very thought-provoking. Yes, it is. Yeah, that's probably an understatement, right? And then thank you from OC. I will damage your name badly. Seminara, maybe?
That's right.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay. Give Carter, life is chaos. We should teach this. Perhaps it would help with trauma when we experience it, because some will affect us all. Because some will affect us all. Absolutely true.
Absolutely.
Jackie just said, love ya. Thanks so much.
Jackie.
Cheryl's saying a thank you too. So I guess that pretty much wraps us up. Thank you all for coming. This live stream has been recorded, and we will be doing some minor editing tweaks to it, and it will become part of the overall 8-part series. So saying good night to all, and thank you again for coming. Dr. Casey, thank you for taking time out of your day and evening now and being with us. Please, everyone, stay safe, be well. You are loved. You're not alone. Good night.
Good night, everybody.